Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. This is Marshall Kirkpatrick here for the inaugural episode of the Sprinklr Coffee Hour. Cheers. I am so excited that you all have come and joined us here today to kick off this series. It's going to be full of inspiring, thought-provoking conversations with some really influential people who are doing incredible work around the internet. And I'm really honored to get to be the host of the show. I am Marshall Kirkpatrick. I'm a vice president over at Sprinklr, responsible for influencer relations, analyst relations, and competitive intelligence. And when I was asked to host this show, I thought immediately about the opportunity to connect with our first guest, Rachel Happe. Rachel is a co-founder of the Community Roundtable and has just completed the research and publication of her 10th annual State of Community Management report, which you can see there in the background. It is an incredible report, really inspiring. Rachel, I am so thankful for you to take the time to come and talk to us about that and all the things you've learned on the internet over the years and what have you. So could I ask you to introduce yourself a little bit, tell us about the CR and about this report you just completed.
Yeah, thank you, Marshall. It's great to be here for the first coffee chat. Let's see, who am I? I have such a crazy background, but we've been doing the CR for 10 years. And originally we started the Community Roundtable because I used to be an industry analyst and I covered social software. And I saw how fast the adoption of social software was taking off. But before I was an analyst, I was a product marketer and product manager in the software space. And before that, I was in operations management at a management consulting firm. And I was looking at this whole space and saying, oh my gosh, this changes everything about the way we communicate, which means that changes everything about the way we manage, that changes everything about the way we lead, that changes everything about the way we operate. And so the companies that I saw going through the garden gate were deers in the headlights from my perspective, meaning they were opening the garden, the gate was slamming behind them, and all of a sudden they were like, oh, everybody's talking to us. What do we do now? And different organizations have taken wildly different approaches to that. Some have seen it more as an opportunity, and some organizations have seen it more as a risk. But I saw a huge opportunity to achieve value that we could have only dreamed of before. So, but we needed to learn a lot. And when we started the CR, there were community managers out there. They were figuring out how to get constructive impact from these loose networks of people who they had no authority over. So they had to use influence and inspiration. So it's a new style of leadership where there's not as much rigid control, but there's a lot more trust and relationship and influence development. So that's kind of why we started the CR. It's been kind of a slow, steady ramp. The market's been a little slower to develop, but it's actually flipping back around, which is really interesting. But that slow start actually was really beneficial to us because it allowed us to do a lot of research. And when we started, everybody was like, community management, it's this art. You either do it or you don't do it, but you can't teach it. And I was like, I don't know about that. But we did have to compile a lot of qualitative data. And of course, once we did, we found patterns. And once you find patterns, you can ask quantitative questions and say, well, how many of you do this? And which patterns really have a meaningful impact? And once you do that, you can kind of mature into benchmarking, which we did a few years ago. And the last couple of years, we've really been focused not so much on how to create a thriving community, because we feel like we more or less know that now, but what is the impact of communities on the organizations that sponsor them? And most of our work is on organizationally sponsored communities. We're not really so focused on kind of social communities or emergent communities.
Wonderful. That's a great introduction. And I love the way that your discussion of online community really addresses the potential that the social web has always offered. And now more and more organizations are starting to see it. And you've provided some great benchmarks and tools and tips and best practices for unlocking that value. That's something that is real important to us here at Sprinklr, where Sprinklr, if anyone is unfamiliar, is the world's first unified platform for the front office. All the different places in an organization where companies deal with their customers. And I like to think that it's in the best cases when your customers really become a community. So there's lots to learn here from Rachel and the CR's research. If you are interested in learning more about Sprinklr, I'll mention this again later in the show. But as we get this started, my good friend Seth Ashby says, email him over at seth.ashby@sprinklr.com. Seth is the man at the front door, really gracious guy. You can reach out to him with any of your questions or concerns about the state of your business that you think Sprinklr might be able to assist with, and chances are we can, and Seth can help point you in the right direction. Similarly, as we discuss the findings from Rachel's research and some other developments in the news here on the Sprinklr Coffee Hour, I hope that you will jump in and share some comments or questions or thoughts. Feel free to post them here in YouTube in the comments, or tweet about them, or wherever you're watching this. Sprinklr's own technology helps us capture all of those comments and bring them into one place where we're keeping track and can facilitate conversation. So let's talk about this report, Rachel. I had so much fun reading it. There's so much here that's inspiring and thought-provoking. But one of the things that I found particularly meaningful was the focus on the way that communities can empower the individuals inside of those communities, and the way that empowerment is a non-trivial matter. It's really a practice, an art, and it has just incredible ROI, if you will, when done. Can you tell us a little bit about that relationship between communities and an empowered individual?
Yeah, and it actually gets to the heart of my passion around this. Is I don't think individuals can reach their potential without strong communities. Meaning communities they help individuals rise and fall to the expectations of the communities around them. And so if their communities are not empowering them, if they're disempowering them, those individuals are not producing their best work. And that's true of organizations, that's true of kids, that's true of any individual. But the empowerment thing is really interesting, because we didn't just ask how often communities empower people. We broke it down and said, okay, how often are communities empowering people to feel seen and heard? That's a thing that's really hard to do in a hierarchy, because by necessity, the leaders of a hierarchy have many, many people underneath them, and their time is precious. So they can't give their attention and time to everybody. In a network structure, there's always capacity there. So people can help each other feel seen and heard in a way that kind of is just not possible in a hierarchy. And that's really the access point for people feeling like they matter enough to say something. Like, why would I say something if nobody cares, or if I'm not worthwhile? And I think we find that in a lot of customer bases, employee bases, where people are like, why even bother? Like,
and what are organizations doing to solve that problem? Given the challenges of scale, how are organizations helping individuals be seen and heard?
Well, so this is why you need a community strategy in my mind, right? So it doesn't happen in a hierarchy. It can't. Like, the structure of a hierarchy makes it really hard. The structure of a network makes it easy because there's always lag capacity somewhere. It's not the same person giving you attention all the time. It's whoever has the capacity at that time. And so it distributes that attention, that engagement, that knowledge, that everything. So like, to me, that's the link that I think a lot of people who want that empowerment are missing. They say, I want that empowerment. I'm going to raise salaries. I'm going to create a comfortable office environment. I'm going to bring dry cleaning in-house so you don't have to go to one more place. All of those things are, of course, great because we have a lot of logistics in our lives, but fundamentally, they don't empower you. What empowers you is somebody caring and listening. That's what influences you. That's what empowers you. And so you need to create a structure whereby there's that capacity.
What's a good example, or how, is there any organizations that you can share stories about, or how do you do it at the CR?
Well, so there's a case study in this year's State of Community Management of an organization that we've been working with for a couple of years, the Canadian Medical Association. And there's a great quote in there by John Feely, who's the VP of membership there. And the quote is, our community ecosystem allows us to say yes to everybody. Now that seems kind of fine. Okay, yeah. What he meant by that, if you listen to him, is in associations, they're policy organizations, right? They're advocacy organizations. He has something like 100,000 members across Canada. That's a lot of constituents. Historically, because they're a hierarchy, they could only deeply engage with about 500 of those constituents, which is a tiny infinitesimal amount. And everybody else kind of had to jockey to get attention and influence. And they had to spend years doing it. And they realized, one, there was an opportunity, and two, the newer members of the organization had other alternatives. They can self-organize elsewhere now because of the internet. And so then what is their value add if they can't engage everybody? I mean, there's still that collective bargaining, collective advocacy that has a lot of power, but they also want to provide access. So by building this ecosystem of wildly different communities across it, they can allow anyone who wants to take leadership to do so. And if they get traction, that influences the organization. And so they can literally say yes to everybody instead of no to 99.9% of their population. And so if you think of the business strategy implications of that, it's a complete flip from really dealing with a small percentage to opening up opportunity to a vastly bigger network.
And how do they structure that? What workflows do they use to empower all those people?
So they're doing an interesting thing to transition. So as part of their digital transformation, they are starting with, I think they have 5 to 8 strategically important priorities from a policy perspective. They have formal communities that they manage around those strategic priorities, and they make sure that conversation is happening. There's a whole nother tier where they provide support and funding for people who apply for a grant for it. So there's hundreds of more little communities and policy initiatives that they're supporting, but not full on. And then they allow anybody else to start a community that they want to. And they say, well, we can't provide any resources, but if you get traction, you can then apply for a grant. And then if you're one of these grant-funded communities, you've got wider access to influence a broader part of the ecosystem. So it's a really smart strategy to kind of slowly shift how the whole thing works without upsetting the entire apple cart and being like, we're just going to go all emergent today.
So that does sound really, really structured. We've got a question in the chat asking about just that, between dedicated, structured communities versus an unstructured online social network versus perhaps one-to-one customer chat. Is there a clear preference in your mind as to which of those three options is suited to make people feel heard?
It depends on the priority, but making people feel heard, peers tend to be more influential than authority figures, meaning if you hear from a peer that something matters and is really important, you're probably going to trust that more than the organization's marketing department saying, this is a great feature, you should try it. I mean, not that that's bad, you might try it anyways, but you're going to have a little like, they clearly have a motive behind that, whether it's good or bad. So there's a lot of value in that peer interaction, one, just from an empowerment perspective. But there's also a lot of value to the transparency of communities. So even private communities, they're big. And so one-on-one chat can be seen by hundreds or thousands of people. And so the next person doesn't have to ask the same question. So you get 10x the value off of one answer versus answering that thing again and again and again in a chat. And some people prefer the chat. I don't dislike the chat. Some people are never going to Google that. They're never going to ask. They're just lazy. But it's really suboptimal from a value perspective.
Okay, so that leads naturally, I think, to the business outcomes that respondents in your research pointed to. They said that there were 3 primary business outcomes resulting from their communities that were externally facing business outcomes, and 3 of the top business outcomes internally facing. External were number 1, customer retention was a big business outcome of having a community. Number 2 was lower support costs, and number 3 was innovation. Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Well, so what was so interesting to me, if you flip to the user value, the second user value from online communities is trust and confidence, which everyone's trying to figure out how to increase trust and confidence because it increases everything else. If you look at the values you just named, customer retention is a complex business problem. It's customer experience, right? It's not marketing, it's not support. Same with innovation. It's product, it's marketing, it's support. And what I think has happened, again, going back to kind of traditional hierarchies and linear processes, is most organizations aren't trying to solve simple or even complicated problems anymore. They're trying to solve complex problems. And complex problems have no one solution. So you can't create a supply chain that's going to address a complex problem. You have to provide a lot of solutions at the edges to all the edge cases of that complex problem. And so communities effectively are complex adaptive systems that can do that. They can catch each part of that problem and solve it where it crops up. And so that's where I see communities really addressing innovation, retention, trust, confidence, idea generation, all of those things.
So we got another follow-on question from the chat asking if you could talk a little bit more about network structure within an organization, for example, for employee advocacy, and contrast that with communities outside of an organization that help drive business. Is that a distinction you see?
Well, so there's a lot to the network structure, right? And it depends on what business outcome you're going for. And if it's advocacy, that's different than innovation, which is different than work efficiency, which is different than professional development. And the shape of the network does matter quite a bit. So if you're going for awareness, you want a broad, loose network, which you can find on Twitter. Like that is a broad, loose network. And there's clumps of communities within it, but there's a lot of boundary spanning that allows information to ripple across. Internally, you can have the same thing in enterprise social networks, right? Where you've got the entire company networked, and then there's private communities within that network. The way we think about it is like an ecosystem, and there's different community types within the ecosystem. And broadly speaking, you can categorize those from communities where work is done to communities of practice where all the structural engineers in your firm get together and talk about structural engineering when they can't figure it out in their work teams. Or there's communications networks, or there's social networks. And so all of those have a slightly different network shape because of the outcome they're going for. And the deeper, more complex the engagement, the smaller, tighter, higher trust environment you need, roughly speaking.
So the number one internal business outcome that your respondents said that they were getting from their communities was cultural and operational or organizational change. What does that mean? What are some examples?
So it's behavior change. It's we're going to do something in a new way. Communities co-create the future together. And so you can get change really quickly because you're doing it together. You're doing it with people. You're not telling people to do it. You're inspiring and rewarding people for changing, and you're norming new behaviors. So communities are one of the best ways to change culture internally.
What's a good example?
I was kind of fascinated that that came out as the like it was really interesting. It's the first year we've seen that pop as high as it has. So an example of that. One of the case studies, again, in the research is from Microsoft's machine learning community. And they basically crowdsource ideas internally. So their machine learning product group has issues a challenge and says, we're working on this algorithm. Hey, the rest of you that want to play with this idea, tell us what you think. And that does a couple of interesting things, which it's marketing communication for what they're doing. It's upskilling the people that participate in that challenge, even though they're not in the same group. So they're getting professional development benefits out of that because they're playing, but having fun on this, something that's challenging. So there's part of the reason I like communities is you kind of double dip on value, right? You get the process value you were going for, but the user gets a value too. And sometimes a third party also gets a value. So everyone ends up winning more than they invest in the community. And it creates a really interesting business model. Mm-hmm. But that's one example. So now you've changed how product development works.
And speaking of that, how internally or externally do communities drive innovation? Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Perhaps offer an example?
Well, so the most well understood part of innovation that communities have is the ideation. We have an idea, we vote it up and down. There's a lot of platforms with that functionality. But I don't actually see that as, I see that as incremental product development, not really innovation. Where I see the capacity for communities to really innovate is in that issuing challenges of, we have this problem, we have no idea how to address it. So come talk to me. What do you see? How do you process this problem? And what are you hearing from our customers? And hey, Mr. Customer, what are you seeing? And can we untangle this giant hairball together? I call that exploring out loud. How do we explore out loud until we identify what can be solved of that really big tangle of issues.
Mm-hmm.
And that conversation is absolutely critical to get to that innovation point. And to me, that's innovation, and that's the power of communities to drive innovation, because they surface problems. Most people actually, my background is in innovation management. Most people who innovate don't actually realize they innovate. And I'll give you a problem. Like, you don't come to work in the morning and sit down at your desk and say, hey, I'm going to innovate today. I'm going to innovate. What do? You come in and you get an email and somebody has a problem. And you solve that problem to the best of your ability. And if it's an innovative solution, you don't recognize it yourself. But if you do, because you were just solving the problem with the tools you had and expertise you had available to you, you don't see how interesting it is. But if you do that out loud in the community, it's the second and third person who come in and go, hey, that's real. I never thought of that. And all of a sudden you're like, oh, yeah, I guess, yeah. Well, and then that's the start of the snowball. And so it's usually the second person or an outside person that has to recognize the innovation. I think we lose innovation all the time because of that, because it gets lost in email. Somebody solved a problem in an innovative way and they moved on to the next problem.
But if people are going to participate in public and share their thoughts out loud, they need to first be empowered and believe that anyone will listen to them and care, and believe that it's a non-threatening environment for them to apply the knowledge that they have into the network.
So yes, it really needs to be a safe space, and that's why you need community management, because that's their job, to make sure that that safety and trust remains.
So I want to talk about some specific examples of community management in practice, but here's a related question in from viewers again, asking about the scale challenge that comes from all of that working out loud, and the content curation challenges. So our viewer says, I see a lot of duplicate questions, for example. How do you build a search first ethos into the community culture, or is there some better way to curate knowledge?
Yeah, so what we see happening is that's a little bit of a multifaceted problem, right? Like in early communities, you need to start having a lot of answered questions. One thing you can do if you start seeing a lot of repetitive questions is curate that out, so that, like, because the noise is not helpful. Having that question asked 1,000 times, if new members come in and just see the same question over and over and over again. We used to work with the H&R Block community. Can you imagine how many times people came in and said, where's my tax return? Like, so you had to create processes to direct those people to where that question and answer already existed. And then as communities mature, so in young communities, there's nothing to search for. So the UX of the community is really geared towards building connections, building conversations. As content builds in the network, you start changing the key behaviors that you're going after, and you change the UX as a result, and you put search front and center, because you don't want people just immediately asking the question. And then also, like, some of the AI stuff that's coming out is fantastic, because it helps surface and offload and curate some of that stuff.
Very cool. So much of this network worldview and collaboration and innovation is really exciting, I know, to me and to you and to many of the people watching here. But before we transition into some other discussion, I know that many of us will need to speak in business terms out to the organizations that we want to invest resources in community building. And I know you've done a lot of work on ROI. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I have the point of view that until we can get to ROI is a budgeting tool. And until we can get to a budgeting process we are not going to get seen, heard. We're not going to matter to the organization, right? Because budgeting is where we account for our values and what matters. And if community is always under the radar or distributed between other budgets, it's never going to rise above kind of this grassroots like beta scenario. And so to me, and the other thing about community is it's a generative process that compounds. And what that means is early on, when you're just starting a community, there's not much value there. Like you're investing a lot to get new behaviors, to compile the information, and that takes a while. And while you're taking a while doing that, and it's a necessary path, your executives are getting frustrated. And they're saying, well, what the heck is going on? Because it's not a linear process. And they're expecting, I invest this, I get that, I invest 2x, I get 2 more. Like, where, show me the beef, right? And so unless you can track the compounding value, you can't really educate them on what to expect. And a lot of executives have invested something on faith that this works. Like they want engagement, they're like, okay, but they're not going to invest a lot in it if they can't see and project the future. And so I felt like it was really, really important to do ROI. And we've had it for a number of years now. And in last year's report, Heather Osmus at Sienna was gracious enough. She's one of our first clients to say, come in, help us project the future ROI of our community. And there's a case study in last year's report where it shows our projections. We did 3 projections and we showed a year of actual to projections and it worked. And so like, that was my kind of nirvana moment because that's what I wanted to get to when I started the CR. And in this year's research, we finally had enough data from our research participants to calculate ROI for them. They gave us the data points so that we could use the same calculation across every participant. We finally had enough to take some cuts at different points and show that geometric curve. What was really interesting to me is it turns out it looks a lot like the innovation S-curve, where it's kind of flat, you're growing, you're figuring something out, and then all of a sudden you like get this inflection point and value just takes off like a rocket. And then it starts kind of like, it doesn't stop, but the growth in value slows quite a bit.
And that's in years 2 to 4 in particular,
yeah.
that the biggest growth.
Yeah. So having that is super valuable to show to executives because now they can say, okay, I know I'm investing on a 6-year program. Like this is not a agency thing where they're gonna like design me a microsite and we're gonna be done. Like that's not what we're doing here.
So what kinds of ROI, what range or what's a sort of a standard number? Is there a percentage or a quick, just to open up the conversation?
Yeah, so the average this year was 6,000, and I don't have the exact off the top of my head, but it was over 6,000%. Part of the reason I think it was so high is value is growing a lot faster than community teams and community budgets. So we're seeing ROI grow a lot faster than costs, for example. So there was actually no correlation between community size, community management team size, and value. It was crazy. Like it was kind of nuts. There was no rhyme or reason.
Wow. So okay. So if you're trying to open up a conversation with leadership whose primary focus is on overhead and revenue, you can say that across the sample size of what's the sample size?
It's 325.
Across 325 organizations of what size?
They're all ranges, but look at the demographics, it's pretty well split across every size of company.
Okay, so they they're seeing an average of 6,000% ROI with the peak of growth being between years 2 and 4.
Yeah, I will say that is helpful. The other super helpful thing is to really dig down and show the impact on workflow and say, I have a slide I call the self-evident slide, and I put it up in front of executives and they go, oh, because it basically says, okay, here's how this workflow happens in email or phone or chat or like whatever. Here's how it happens in a community. There's a lot of marginal value of having it happen in the community because you're getting answers from people you don't know, and there may be better answers, and you may get it from the subject matter expert who you don't know, or you didn't even know you didn't know. So there's some marginal value there. The real value comes in that transparency, because if the third person comes and has the same question, that workflow probably has, I don't know, how many, like it depends on the workflow, but it could have 10 questions involved in the workflow. And now I can ask 10 questions and get all those answers in like an hour or two versus days and days and days from like navigating around the organization and like you think about the sales engineer trying to get information from the customer and product teams and this and that and whatever. It takes a long time via email or phone to navigate around to what the right answer is.
But if you've got a well-cultivated
community,
strategic community that has been developed over time, that there's a big decrease in time to value.
Yep.
That's fantastic. Good. Well, the research that you published is full of numbers and stories and words of inspiration. I've had a lot of fun reading it again this year, and I hope folks will go and check it out at the Community Roundtable site. I want to transition, Rachel, into talking a little bit about your take. You've got this incredible vantage point out into this increasingly networked world we live in. I really believe and hope that the world is moving in a direction of less hierarchy, more networked models, and I know that you're right at the center of a lot of that online, and that's something that we take real seriously at Sprinklr. And if you are just now joining us here, a little past the halfway point of the inaugural episode of the Sprinklr Coffee Hour. We're here with Rachel Happe, co-founder of the Community Roundtable. We just spent some time talking about their 10th annual State of Community Management report. And we're reading that closely and finding a lot of inspiration from it. And if some of those forms of value are things that you would like a solution for in pursuit of that kind of value, that's something that we do work with organizations here at Sprinklr with. And you can email my buddy and yours, Seth Ashby, seth.ashby at Sprinklr.com. And Seth will hook you up, whatever your community aspirations are, whatever business problems you're thinking that a more networked organization and means of listening and engagement with your customers might be. Seth can route you to the right people over here in Sprinklr. So let's talk about the world at large a little bit, Rachel.
Mm-hmm.
And when you were mentioning a bit ago about how budgeting is like a manifestation of our values, it reminded me of something you were talking about on Twitter the other day, sharing an AOC video. You made a similar kind of comment, and among your extensive and really thought-provoking tweets are a number of them about politics, and you called out a new opportunity in particular that you found inspiring. That being that Elizabeth Warren's campaign is hiring a community manager.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder, why was that so inspiring to you?
Probably because the last election, I was waiting for somebody to have a community that we would discuss policy issues. and it didn't happen. And so I've been waiting for a while because I'm like, this is an amazing opportunity to change the conversation, to be more inclusive, and nobody's taking it. And nobody did take it last time around. And so the very fact that she has a community is amazing. And I've been poking around in it for the last few days because that's what I do. But it also, to me, said that people are understanding the power of building intentional communities, intentional digital communities outside of not exactly the echo chamber, but like there's an ecosystem within which I inhabit. It's gotten beyond that. And that's pretty exciting. And I'm a politics major, right? So all of my work really at its core comes down to power, right? How do we negotiate power? How do we share power? How do we use power? And what's interesting, like the conversations there's all sorts of conversations about healthcare, like they're policy conversations. What do we think about education? I was reading a thread the other day about charter schools. People wanted her to have a position on charter schools. And what's true about charter schools is they're wildly different depending on the state that you live in. And so what was happening is people were educating each other about the reality of the issue and how perceptions are wildly different because charter schools are not one thing. They're very different depending on where you're from. Sometimes they're all run by for-profit organizations. Sometimes they're run by the school district and they're all nonprofit and they can be run by any. So like, anyways, that's an example of how she's scaling education about policy issues where she doesn't have to be the sole person educating people. And it helps all those people who are having those conversations feel like they're part of it. It's not Elizabeth Warren's campaign anymore. It's our campaign. And yes, you always need the person at the top kind of being the spokesperson, but it's more than a cult of personality. It's we want to do something, and we want as many people who want to be included in that to be included in that. That's really powerful.
Are you ready to offer, if you had one piece of advice to that community, what might it be?
Yeah, so the one thing that kind of gave me pause, and I kind of understand it, and so it's something they'll have to navigate. But right now, it is very oriented around people who want to work actively for Elizabeth Warren, versus it's very kind of targeted towards people with progressive ideas who want to contribute to the campaign in an activism kind of way. And I think there's a broader opportunity. I understand how that gets dicey in a hurry, though. So, it's a mild criticism, not a severe criticism. I just think there's a bigger opportunity.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Speaking of opportunities, feel free, folks, to pop into comments wherever you are and ask questions, make your perspective known, and we will pick it up using the Sprinklr technology and Sprinklr's Customer Experience Center. That team is listening to your comments, and we've gotten some really good questions and comments already. Rachel, I'd like to talk about a different example of an online community that you noted was undergoing some big transformation lately and in some interesting ways. And that was the Wall Street Journal community formerly known as the comment section.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that and why you thought it was so interesting?
Well, so it's interesting because was it a year ago or so? There was a bunch of news sites that were just shutting off comments because they had gotten to be such a dumpster fire that they were like, we just can't. And I thought that was really short-sighted, but again, I also understood why, because they they never moderated it. So it had turned into this just cesspool of people who wanted to kvetch. What the Wall Street Journal has done is, and I think NPR is doing this as well. So it's not just the Wall Street Journal, but it was the article about the Wall Street Journal that I shared. One, they have audience engagement journalists now, which is fascinating. So they're hiring people to facilitate and have the conversation with the community. But they're monitoring the heck out of it as well. And they're saying, you know what? Not anybody gets to come in here and just like spew and spew and spew. We're actually going to talk about the topic of the article in a professional, respectful manner. And again, it's similar to the Elizabeth Warren community. There is huge potential for education there. Like if you can get people involved and actually answer their questions, you can understand the assumptions that they're making and why they feel the way they are, and really help expose both for the journalist and the reader what's going on. And to me, it's another example of someone's kind of outside of my little world of internet engagement, really understanding the power of that. And the other thing that it relates to from the research is we found that communities with advanced strategies, which means to us measurable operational strategies, could mitigate all negative and neutral sentiment around their brand or culture, meaning all the value generated from the community was a positive add to their culture and brand. That is not what people traditionally think of when they think of online engagement. They think, oh, of course it's going to be a dumpster fire. And we've said for a long time, no, if you manage it well, it's not a dumpster fire. You normalize the culture you want to have, but you have to hire community managers to do that. You can't just let people have a free-for-all, because they'll have a free-for-all. And yes, technology can help, but like it's super smart that they're starting to understand that.
Well, let me make that explicit. You're saying that a free-for-all, unmanaged community can, in many cases, represent a big risk and cost and be full of negative impacts for a brand, but a deliberately managed community with a strategy, almost any strategy that includes measurement of outcomes, can take that and swing the needle entirely from the negative over to being entirely in the positive.
For the advanced strategies, there wasn't even any neutral impact. It was all positive. 100% positive contribution to the brand.
Wow.
And you add that to the engagement rates, 50% of communities engage on average. Like if you compare that to the engagement rates on Facebook or Twitter or whatever, all of a sudden investing in your own community doesn't seem so crazy.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know I like to extrapolate a lot of the things that you discuss about on private communities or brand communities into how we might relate to community members out in the open web, the social web as well. Is that a fair thing to do?
Yeah, and almost all of our clients who are doing customer communities, they have social media outposts everywhere, meaning they don't not want to hear what's going on everywhere else. They don't want to not integrate, but there's a handshake that they develop a governance, an ecosystem strategy that says, here are the conversations we'll have over on Twitter. But if you want to if you really want to get into it, you're going to have to come over here to have that conversation. We're happy to have it, but you need to come over here.
Nice. So speaking of that kind of operational and strategic perspective, we've got a question from chat asking, this is a great one, and I think it could be a good one to wrap up on, and that is about the future. Rachel, where do you see the role of community managers going in the next 3 to 5 years, and what are the most important skill sets that will be required?
Oh, that's a little bit tough. I do like one of the major findings of the reports is community managers freaking need to get business skills. Like business often, like you say business to community and relationship people, and they're like, ooh. But Angela Blanchard, who's like just hot stuff. Does a lot of community development. We were chatting, and she's like, budgeting is the most powerful advocacy tool you have. And so if you don't understand your budgeting process, you are never going to be a powerful advocate. So if you want your community to be successful, you better well understand your budgeting process. Like find a friend in finance, like go take them to lunch and spend as much time as you need helping them understand what's going on in the community. And you try and understand what's going on in their world that they're looking for. That's the way you're going to get, and we're seeing that. So I'm, like if you look at one of our members is Monique Vandenberg at Atlassian. They don't really have traditional marketing. They use their community as marketing. So community can be applied to almost any process to supercharge it. So what I'm going to see, like I used to say 5 or more years ago, I started saying, well, community management's the future of all management. And people would look at me like I had 3 heads because they had never connected the two. And now we're seeing that. And I've added to it, which is I think community leadership is the future of all leadership, and community strategy. And what I mean by that is shared purpose, shared value. Like don't just think of it as a transaction, but really get that shared win is the future strategy, because it's a more productive approach to business.
Well said. And so much of that comes through in this report that you've just published, the state of community management in 2019. It really, you come for the community management and you stay for the wisdom and inspiration on business and engagement with the world at large. So congratulations on
thank you for having me on your first coffee chat. It was great to be here.
Yeah, it's been a real pleasure, and big thanks to everyone who helped with production of the show and everyone who came and asked questions and provided all support along the way. I hope that you will come and join us, not next week, but in 2 weeks, we will be having Amber Naslund, who is a content marketing leader at LinkedIn, on as our next guest. And Rachel, you know Amber,
yes,
I bet.
It's awesome.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. So we'll talk about content marketing and social media marketing and all the things that Amber knows about in our next Sprinklr Coffee Hour. I hope that you are feeling well caffeinated, and I hope that you are intrigued to learn more here. The ways that you can best do that are to visit the Community Roundtable and to check out Rachel's awesome presence on Twitter. I would say at Happe. Rachel, is that anything else you'd recommend along those lines?
Yeah, I think out loud a lot on Twitter. So or mull out loud. Is that a phrase we can use? I think out loud a lot on Twitter.
That's awesome. It's lots of fun. I try to engage with Rachel whenever I can, as do hundreds, if not thousands, of community management professionals on a regular basis. So come and tweet with us. And if you are interested in learning about the technology that we're using to market this show, to listen to our community that we seek to build here, and that we help provide many of the world's largest organizations here at Sprinklr, you can email Seth. Seth is the best. He's seth.ashby@sprinkler.com. And he wants to hear from you. And we want to hear from you too. So please come, keep your eyes peeled for the next episode of Sprinklr Coffee Hour in 2 weeks with Amber Naslund, and keep the conversation going. Let's build the community that we deserve to have, and change the world in a more networked and empowering way.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rachel. All right, take care, everybody.